Hi students. We are now going to go ahead and move on to our chapter on motivation. Motivation is an important thing to think about when it comes to psychology. Psychologists love to ask the question, why do we behave the way we do? And it's a pretty foundational question when it comes to psychologists. What's the motivation? Why do we behave the way that we do? In this chapter, we're going to do a couple of different things in terms of our learning objectives. We're going to define motivation. We're going to look at some different theories that explain motivation, and those theories are going to include instinct theory, drive reduction theory, arousal theory, and incentive theory. We're going to think through some intrinsic and extrinsic sources of motivation, and then we're going to look at the relationship between intrinsic motivation and cognition, and try to ask ourselves, well, why are some people so intrinsically motivated? And we're going to look at the research of McClelland and also look at Maslow. Finally, we're going to look at the relationship between motivation and physiology and see some of the theories, examine some of the theories around hunger and around sex. So what is motivation? Motivation influences are the influences that account for the initiation, direction, intensity, and persistence of behavior. A motive is a single explanation for one's diverse behaviors. Motivation cannot be directly observed. It needs to be inferred from what can be observed, or you can just simply ask the person, why did you do what you did? Sources of motivation can include physiological factors, emotional factors, cognitive factors, and even social and environmental factors. And we're going to try to touch on some of these as we move through the lecture. So when we look at some of the different theories of motivation, there are several theories that try to answer the question, why do we behave the way we do? One of those includes instinct theory. We know organisms have inherited tendencies to produce organized and unalterable responses to particular stimuli. James was really one of the first to theorize that the reason people behave the way they do is because of instinct. The idea behind instinct theory is that our behavior is motivated by instincts. In other words, we do what we do, we behave the way that we do because of instincts. Basically, we get caught up in a fixed action pattern. The weakness of this theory is that human behavior is a lot more complex and a lot more flexible than instincts can explain. We're motivated by a wider net than simply instinct. We can move beyond instinct. We just don't do things and say, well, I couldn't help myself. I had to do it. It was my instinct. So we've developed other theories, things that include drive reduction theory, that motivation arises in response to internal imbalances, and basically that we're driven to reach a state of homeostasis. Homeostasis is the tendency for physiological systems to remain at a stable, steady level by constantly adjusting themselves in response to change. The body wants to maintain a state of equilibrium. Basically, equilibrium is balance. Our bodies like to be balanced. And both deficits and surpluses are to be avoided. So a couple examples of this include things like if you overeat, you feel terrible. If you're hungry, you feel terrible. If you don't sleep enough, you feel terrible. If you oversleep, you feel terrible. Our body wants just the right amount. It wants to be in equilibrium. It wants homeostasis. And the body has these drives to keep your needs balanced. You have primary drives, things like food, sleep, water, and then you have secondary drives, things like money, things that you might use to get your primary drives met. The weakness of this theory is that it assumes the goal is homeostasis. But sometimes what happens is that people seek out increased or decreased levels of arousal. So here's a nice image here that kind of tries to visually lay out drive reduction theory. The mechanisms of homeostasis regulate your body temperature and food and water intake, among other things. So if you don't have enough nutrients in your bloodstream, an unbalanced equilibrium is created and your body develops a need for food. This biological disturbance leads your drive to find something to eat, perhaps ordering a pizza, and after eating that, your need is satisfied and your equilibrium is restored. If you don't eat the pizza, you feel hungry, you feel famished, you feel crabby. If you eat too much pizza, also don't feel so good. Arousal theory, a theory stating that people are motivated to maintain what is, for them, an optimal level of arousal. For the most part, arousal theory suggests that we seek out intermediate levels of stimulation. People's level of arousal can vary, and it varies according to their physiological systems. Some people have a very high need for arousal. That's why some people skydive, and some people very low need for arousal, and that's why they may become librarians or they prefer quiet activities. You have people that are risk takers, who like to move quickly and drive fast and gamble, and people who have high aversion to any sort of risk and want to stay calm and even and steady and do Tai Chi and meditate. One of the weaknesses in terms of arousal theory is that it can't explain long-term motivation. It can't really explain why it is that some people are able to set very long-term goals and work towards those. But what's interesting is that when we look at something like Yerkes-Dodson law, we find that people perform most effectively when their state of arousal is moderate, when it's dead on and nice and even. So when we look at an image like this, if you're performing a task that requires a very low performance level, in other words, it's easy, it's boring, you might need a higher level of arousal. If you're performing a task that's very difficult, you might want your arousal level to be a little bit lower. So one of the things that I always try to explain to students is if you're doing something that's boring and repetitive like housework, you may want to turn your radio on, turn your music on. When you're performing a difficult task like studying for exam, you want to bring your arousal levels down. You don't want the distraction. No music, no television, quiet area in order to be able to engage in a task that is cognitively much more difficult. And again, like I mentioned, arousal theory states that people are motivated to maintain their own optimal level of arousal. And some people's level of arousal can vary according to their physiological systems. This is the research of Zuckerman. Some people just simply prefer a high level of arousal, while some have lower levels of optimal arousal. We often find that people who are risk takers or enjoy in engaging in work where there is an element of danger involved, say firefighting, they have a tendency or need for a higher level of arousal than opposed to, say, somebody who would prefer a lower level of arousal, like a librarian. Incentive theory. It's a theory stating that people are pulled toward behaviors offering positive incentives and pushed away from behaviors associated with negative incentives. What's great about incentive theory is it recognizes that we are motivated toward particular goals in anticipation of a reward. So you've got the incentive, and then you've got the ultimate reward that comes with it. The problem here is that it does focus in on external stimuli, but it allows us to be able to tease apart differences in behavior, and that those differences can be traced back to differences in values that are placed on the incentives. So, for example, why might a person deal drugs? Well, most people would not deal drugs because they find the threat of prison, the punishment, to be so negative that they would never engage in that sort of behavior. But others might find the incentive of money or the incentive of being around drugs to be so positive that they're drawn to the behavior. Achievement motivation. Why do some people try harder than others to succeed? One of the ways we try to understand why some people are driven toward achievement is to look at their motivation. Are they intrinsically versus extrinsically motivated? Intrinsic motivators are the rewards that come from within the individual. People that engage in intrinsic motivators have a tendency to be the most creative. They're driven by things like curiosity, self-determination, satisfaction, self-efficacy. This is feelings of being competent enough to achieve your goal. Individuals that are intrinsically motivated have a tendency to be very much oriented toward achievement and goal setting, as opposed to people that are more extrinsically motivated, which are rewards that come from outside the individual, things like money or things like pleasing others. When we look at something like job satisfaction, we often find that for people that it isn't the money that's connected to being satisfied with a job. Job satisfaction is most highly correlated with things like self-efficacy, feeling competent, feeling challenged, being able to be in charge of one's work and controlling one's workflow. One way we can assess whether or not a person has high achievement motivation is by giving them a TAT, a thematic apperception test. So this is something else, a test that we also cover when we talk about personality psychology. So what we do is we show them an image such as this one of this is of a child holding a violin, and we ask them to infer from the picture what they think is going on, and then they tell a story. So a response like, well, this boy is thinking about playing his violin in a concert at Carnegie Hall would be seen as reflecting someone who's high in achievement motivation. Other ways we test for need for achievement or intrinsic motivation is McClelland's work. McClelland did a series of studies on need for achievement. And need for achievement is the degree to which a person sets goals, cares about meeting them, and experiences satisfaction from doing so. McClelland's original study had college students come in and build as many small structures as they could with Tinker Toys or Lincoln Logs. And what he found was that those that scored in high need for achievement would build significantly more than those who did not. Then when he paid them, then he said, okay, I will pay you so much for every structure that you build. It didn't have any impact on those who scored high in need for achievement. They still built the same number. A more modern study looks at children, and it asks children to engage in a ring toss, and it finds that those children that are low in need for achievement either stand very, very close to the cone, and so they can be sure that the ring gets on the cone, or they stand so far away there's no way that they could get it. But those that score in high need for achievement have a tendency to stand at a realistic but challenging distance. So what we know is that those that are high in need for achievement seek out moderately difficult tasks. They like to engage in tasks that are challenging, but that they know that they can complete them. So they are in a consistent process of setting challenging but realistic goals. Can need for achievement be developed in children? It depends. Some research indicates that there is a real genetic or nature component to a need for achievement. Some personality traits, such as impulsivity and emotionality, can really undermine a need for achievement, while other traits, such as persistence, can develop a need for achievement. There's been a whole series of studies done by Angela Duckworth on this idea of persistence and grit as being one of the best predictors of success. Not IQ, not grades in school, but really how well will a person stay on task? Will they persist? What kind of grit do they have in order to get them to completion? Can you nurture a need for achievement? Can you nurture grit? Can you nurture persistence? Are there things that we can do in the environment to encourage children to develop this quality? There are some things that parents can do and teachers can do, things like encouraging children to try difficult tasks, getting them to build that Lego set that's just a little bit more difficult than what they're comfortable with, giving praise for the success, encouraging children to find ways to succeed. If they're working on that Lego set and they just and they're just stuck, sending them back to the directions, having them try again. And once they build it and they can build it successfully, prompt them to move on to more difficult tasks, prompt them to move on to more challenging tasks, moving on to that harder book to read, or that harder puzzle to complete. All of that builds persistence and grit. Okay, Maslow's hierarchy of motives. Maslow, we've become familiar with Maslow. He's a humanist psychologist. Talked a lot about that people have an intrinsic drive towards self-actualization, to being the person that they were meant to be, to maximizing their own potential. He writes, though, that in order for them to become self-actualized, they need to go through or move through this hierarchy of needs. The first, most basic need is physiological, which is the need for food, water, oxygen. Once that need is met, they're able to move up to the next need, which is safety. Things like nurturing, money, a secure place to live, shoes, comfort, warmth, shelter, those sorts of things. From there, they go up to belongingness and love, the need for acceptance, the need for affection, family, friends. Once that need is met, they can then move on to esteem. Things like respect, feelings of competence, being able to feel like you can accomplish a task. Keep in mind that if a person loses their ability to meet their physiological needs, they would then move back down to the base of the hierarchy and have to work their way back up again. Maslow would then say some people hit that point of self-actualization, which is maximizing one's potential. What that really means is that they are living in the moment, they trust themselves implicitly, they are professionally and personally setting their goals, meeting their goals. They have few but very close friends that they trust. They do not dwell on the past, but live in the present and keep their eyes on the future. And Maslow would call those individuals self-actualized. Sometimes people that are self-actualized might have peak experiences, which is this idea of being at one with the task. All right, now we're going to look a little bit at what motivates us physiologically. We're going to start by talking about eating. What makes me start eating and stop eating? So what regulates hunger? What regulates eating? Basically, we're looking for signals for hunger and satiation. Now, often students believe, well, these signals come from the gut. And there are times when you're going to feel those hunger pains or hunger pangs, depending on how you call them. But really, hunger does not come from the gut. The blood sends signals in regards to our nutrient levels, particularly lipids, glucose, and amino acid levels. And it sends that information up to the brain, particularly up to the hypothalamus. And it's really the role of the hypothalamus to monitor our hunger and satiation. There is a theory called the set point theory that argues that the hypothalamus pretty much sets our weight, that there is a relationship between parts of the hypothalamus that monitor hunger and other parts that monitor feeling satiated, and then we basically operate or function within that set point. There's been a lot of challenges to this theory, and the primary challenge is that it's just simply a much more complex process than this interplay between these areas of the hypothalamus. There's a lot more involved. There's other neurotransmitters and other brain chemicals that are involved. There's also aspects of the food itself. When we look at the flavor of food, some people seem to prefer foods that are high in fat, or high in salt or high in sugar. And that has everything to do with palate training. What did they grow up eating? What are they used to eating? How are they used to eating? The appearance and smell of food can play a huge role in what you eat and how much of it you eat. We find that people that are given a plate of food will eat that plate and no more. But if they're given the opportunity to go up to, say, a buffet, they will eat significantly more food. Simply because the context of how they're getting the food has changed. The social rules and cultural traditions that we have around food can impact a lot in terms of what we eat and how much we eat. Some people really function out of a food culture. In other words, they plan their vacations around food, and they think about food, and celebrations happen around food. So what you're eating can be very culturally impacted. When we start to think a little bit more deeply about things like eating disorders, and obesity is considered an eating disorder. Obesity is simply defined as being severely overweight. This is a body mass index, a BMI of greater than 30. There are about 34% of U.S. adults, about 1/3 of U.S. adults are considered obese. So this is becoming one of the most important health epidemics that we are facing in this country, because obesity is related to things like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and high blood pressure. So we've done a lot of research trying to help us to understand what causes obesity. Simply put, the overwhelming amount of research points to inadequate physical activity combined with overeating. In other words, a person just simply eats too much and does not move around enough. We do find that changing your eating habits seems to have a quicker impact on losing weight, but both things need to happen. Eating habits need to change, they need to improve, and people need to become physically active. They cannot spend hours sitting and expect to stay thin. Other explanations that we've looked at include family. What impact does family have on obesity? We do see that there is seems to be a genetic predisposition. Obesity seems to run in families. So one theory looks at genes, particularly these genes called thrifty genes. So from an evolutionary perspective, we say that these are genes that have been passed down through generations, and these genes are very efficient at storing calories and storing fat, so that in times of scarcity, this individual is at an advantage. Another theory looks at things like modeling or learning behaviors. What did a child learn about food and about eating habits from their family of origin? What they ate, how much of it they ate, portion size. Were they eating fruits and vegetables? Were they eating salty snacks? We find now that Americans get about half their meals outside the home. They're not hesitant to go to fast food, and that all palate trains children to prefer to eat foods that are high in fat, high in sodium, and high in sugar. Other research looks at the role of leptin. Leptin is a hormone that regulates fat intake. The idea here is that the fat that you have in your body will release the hormone leptin, letting your body know that you need to decrease your fat intake. Some research indicates that people who are obese do not produce as much leptin or do not produce leptin at all. Another theory looks at the role of addiction. Can a person become addicted to food? And they look at the brain. Is the brain hardwired in this positive feedback loop? So when the person eats, it hits their reward circuitry. They feel satisfied, and they feel pleasant, and they feel good, which then turns around and causes them to eat more. The last theory I want to touch on is the idea of human biome, which looks at the microbe or the microbiota that lives in our guts. The thinking here is that if that biome is manipulated, that you can cause a person to become obese. So I have this little image here of chubby mouse and skinny mouse. And this is research that's been done on, they're called germ-free mice that do not have any microbes in their gut. And they find that if they manipulate it, some mice become overweight and obese, and others don't. Two other eating disorders that I want to touch upon include anorexia nervosa, which is characterized by self-starvation and a dramatic weight loss, and also bulimia. Bulimia involves eating mass quantities of food and then eliminating the food by self-induced vomiting or laxatives. These eating disorders, about 95% of people who struggle with these eating disorders are female. And research tells us that up to about 30% die. Overall, it impacts about 1 to 3% of the general population. It is when a person develops anorexia or bulimia, it becomes almost a lifelong struggle. It's a very challenging disorder to treat, and psychologists struggle with thinking through what the causes of anorexia and bulimia might be. Some different things that we psychologists have looked at include things like media images. Does the media play a role in impacting the ways that women see their bodies? We know that women who struggle with anorexia and bulimia seem to be very focused on appearance, very focused on body image, very focused on being thin or staying thin. They read fashion magazines voraciously, which have tons of images of very, very thin women. But the challenge of this theory is that while we know that in popular culture, the message is very strongly sent that being thin is important, all women who are seeing these images, lots of women are seeing these images, but not all of them are developing anorexia and bulimia. So we have to turn to other possible explanations. And one of them is OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So basically, the person is obsessed with the idea of being thin or staying thin. They have all sorts of obsessions around thinness, and then they develop compulsions, certain rituals around what to eat, how to eat, when to eat, quantities of food, measuring food, journaling food. They become very sort of focused in. We know that there are some neurotransmitters that are involved in the development of OCD and, by extension, certain eating disorders. So this is an area for a lot of study, for a lot of research. Addiction. Addiction is another theoretical paradigm that we can use to help explain anorexia and bulimia. Some psychologists would argue that women who suffer from this disorder become addicted to being thin. So when you look at women who are anorectic or bulimic, they will say things like, nothing feels better than being thin. Nothing makes me feel more empowered than being able to push away that plate of food. And the thinking here is that much like an alcoholic or a gambling addict, the brain releases endorphins that make them feel good when they're able to turn down food, when they lose weight, and they become addicted to that feeling in the pursuit of this rush of endorphins. Another theory looks at the intersection of sexual violence and eating disorders. And interestingly, we find many women who suffer from anorexia and bulimia have also been victimized by sexual violence. And the thinking here is that rape is an act of violence where control of the body is lost, while eating disorder is all about regaining control of that body, being able to control everything that's coming in and out, sort of shrinking the body, taking up less space. What's very interesting here is that psychologists that take this approach, when they have a client come in with an eating disorder, they often don't spend very much time talking about the eating disorder, but rather have them talk about other areas of their life. Have them talk about things that they are finding difficult or challenging or emotionally difficult, rather than talk about the eating disorder itself. Okay, we're going to look at the role of motivation and physiology and sexual behavior. So we're going to start off focusing a little bit on research, and I want to start off by saying that conducting research on sex has its challenges. A fundamental assumption that psychologists make when they do research is that they assume the people that they are interviewing are telling the truth and giving an honest representation of their behaviors. And when we do sex on research, the same assumptions are made. You're very careful to create samples that are diverse and that are representative of your general population, and you let those participants understand that this is research on sex, that they are going to be asked questions that are going to be personal in nature, and then you assume that they're going to tell you the truth. There had been often a lot of concern around research on sex that people would grossly exaggerate or grossly underrepresent what their actual behaviors were. But researchers have found that people seem to be honest when answering questionnaires on sexual behavior. So some of the things we found is that people in the United States have sex less often and with fewer partners than many had assumed. People in committed one-partner relationships had the most frequent and satisfying sex. So even when we look at this from a developmental perspective, what we find is that once people get married and they become monogamous, or they get involved in a long-term serious relationship, that the sex there is the most frequent and also the most physically and emotionally satisfying. The majority of heterosexual couples report engaging in mainly penis-vagina intercourse. So a lot of researchers were surprised by the findings, but what it points to is that there's still a lot more work to be done. All right, so motivation physiology, much like hunger, when it comes to sex, it's primarily the hypothalamus that is involved. The hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary gland to release androgens and estrogens. 98% of people have sex for pleasure now. They're having it for recreation as opposed to procreation. And most people go through what is called the sexual response cycle. Now, this is the research of Masters and Johnson, originally done in the 1960s, where they actually filmed people and recorded their sexual response cycle. And what they found is that people go through predominantly 4, and for men it would be 5 stages. The first one is excitement. The second stage is plateau, which is that stage right before orgasm. Then orgasm, then resolution. Men go through a 5th stage, which is refractory, which is a time period where they need to recover. Women don't necessarily need that, and so they can turn around and cycle back into excitement. There are 3 main types of sexual orientations: heterosexual, which is sexual desire for members of the opposite sex; homosexual, sexual desire for members of the same sex; and bisexual, sexual desire for members of both sexes. So how do we explain different sexual orientations? We know that about 10% of the population is gay or lesbian. A lot of research has predominantly focused in on biological differences or biological explanations. A main area of research has included twin studies. So we've discussed twin studies off and on throughout the course. These are monozygotic and dizygotic twins, so identical twins and fraternal twins that have been separated at birth. So it allows us to take a look at how genes might be influencing behavior. In twin studies, we find just over 52% concordance with monozygotic twins. So in other words, if one twin is gay, there's an over 50% likelihood the other one will also be gay, while we only see about a 22% concordance with dizygotic twins. So it's higher than in the general population because, of course, dizygotic twins do share some genes, but not as high as monozygotic twins. For a long time, the long-standing theory was that there might be some sort of link on the X chromosome, and there's still research being done in this area. Research now seems to be indicating that it may be more complex than a single gene on the X chromosome. There's probably other genes involved. Brain structure, this is another area that we have looked at for a biological explanation. Do we see differences in the structure of the hypothalamus? And in Simon LeVay's work, we do see differences between gay men and straight men in terms of the structure of the hypothalamus. Prenatal development. We find that some women who have been exposed to androgen during prenatal development may influence or impact the sexual orientation of their children. Another piece of research that is hormonal in nature and also focuses in on prenatal development is the fact that homosexual men are more likely to have older brothers. And the thinking here is that when women have a boy child, that child will produce testosterone or androgens in order to help initiate sexual differentiation. So when she has her first son, she might not have any reaction. Her second son, she might not have any reaction. But by the third time, her body might start to produce an immune response to those hormones, and might try to an immune response that might interfere with the production of those hormones.